Hey there. Welcome back to Story Time. I'm happy to be here again because this is just very fun for me. And I'm thrilled there are a few people here joining me because in the United States, this is 4th of July. Um, and, um, I imagine that a lot of people are just kind of out having a good time, taking the day off, doing whatever, sitting by a body of water, in or by a body of water, all kinds of things like that. So just delighted that some of you wanted to join me. It makes me really happy. I appreciate that. Thank you. And yeah, so there's some of my new friends, right? My new online people. How better to celebrate July 4th than a gay Jesus? I think you're right, Caitlin. Okay. Yeah, and this would have been really great for the month of June, right? But we're just extending pride this way, right? So yeah, thank you for that comment. So here's the thing. There's so much to say, and let me just set the stage just a little bit. So yeah, I'm going to keep doing this indefinitely. We have a lot of content from the Bible that meets the criteria for my story time. That in and of itself is noteworthy, right? So I will keep going. And I'm trying to wrap up the Gospels. And I think today is the last day, and I will double check to make sure I've not forgotten another story from any of the 4 Gospels, but I think this is it. So that means that starting Thursday or next week, if I've forgotten something, we will go back to Hebrew Bible stuff and start working through Exodus and, so much content, right? There's so much content. So we'll go back to Hebrew Bible once we're done with Gospels. Okay. I'm doing story time, which is reading biblical passages that touch on sex, the relationships we call marriage, and or any sort of physical harm that involves intimate body parts. Instead of saying sexual assault, I'm trying to keep from putting a positive sex as a qualifier to something negative, assault. That just doesn't sit well with me. So thus the extended description. I do want to comment that I hesitated to acknowledge July 4th because I forgot to acknowledge Juneteenth. I am wearing red, white, and blue as a nod to this important day in this country's celebration of existence and identity and struggles to be continuous, to still be full of the good things that we'd like us to stand for. So yeah, I'll acknowledge July 4th for Americans and people in I'm drawing a blank, not just the United States, but also territories, that kind of thing. But I also want to say that I'm sorry that I neglected to reference Juneteenth when that day came around. I have oddly enough, have a deeper emotional connection to that day than to this day. All of that said, I also have family members and dear loved ones who have served in the military. So this isn't a slight on sacrifices made. This is a commentary on the larger picture, politically speaking. Okay, so anyway, there we are. Okay, so this is a topic. Today's topic is looking at the character referred to as the beloved disciple, who only makes a showing in John's gospel. Okay, so there are several things to note about John's gospel. One is that it is the latest of the 4 gospels. 2, it is the only one from which we actually get Jesus as being identified with God. I know that might sound strange to some people, but it's actually true. Again, a lot of people, when they hear a reference to Son of God, they think that means God-like, or they think that means a God here on earth. And actually, it's not. It's a way of saying a human who is being ascribed some form of God-like qualities, or they've done something supernatural and amazing, so he must be son of a god, that kind of a thing. I don't want to get into it too much, but I do think it's worth, and it shocked me the first time I heard all this stuff, right? And it took me a long time to wrap my head around it and think of a human when I heard someone use the label son of God. It just seems like God to me. But it's not. So what that means is it is only in John's gospel that we get absolutely clear. I mean, you cannot miss it. Identification of Jesus with God. what happens for most people that grow up in a Christian tradition then is you have 20 centuries of tradition you're being handed, or close to it, 1800 years, something like 18 centuries. You have right, eons of tradition built on these ideas, and they're blended together, and people are not taught to think about Matthew separately from Mark, from Luke and John. Like, people are not taught to think of them separately. It's one of the first things you do in an intro course to the Bible from an academic perspective, is to look at the Gospels separately instead of blending them all together. And I actually think, as a biblical scholar and as a former evangelist, I think it is utterly much more respectful to them to look at them separately and honor them separately for what they're each trying to depict for people, whoever's listening or reading about this guy Jesus. Okay, so there's that. It's the latest of the four. There's that. It's the only one making actual theological claims about Jesus. So it stands in contrast to the other three. This isn't a neener. The Bible isn't perfect or anything like that kind of a thing. This is a reality that I think is helpful to acknowledge. When we get to the Gospel of John, we've got a very different set of agendas, and I don't mean that in a negative way, going on for the author. The author of John's Gospel is absolutely trying to speak to a Greek audience. The author of John's Gospel is using Greek ideas all over the place. The opening scene, I won't do it today. I'll do it when I'm prepared to do it. But the opening scene is like this cosmic, setup, and just, you can't miss it. That Jesus is God in John. He walks around talking about, I am this, I am that, I am claiming, all these different claims about what Jesus is, which is so different from what we get in the first gospel, which was Mark, where people say who he is and he clamps it down. He's like, shh, don't tell anyone. Keep that to yourself. Psh, psh, right? We have very different messages. We have very different audiences. We have a very different agenda. Again, I don't mean that in a negative way. So what we get about Jesus in John's Gospel is the farthest removed from being historically accurate, and is absolutely doing this theological massaging. I was going to say manipulation, and that sounds too negative for people. So I've already said it, but there's something different almost at every level going on in John's Gospel from the three synoptics. And that's another reason why I think when I first encountered this scholarship that I'm going to present as we talk about John, this element of John's Gospel, first time I encountered this, it was too much for me. I'll just be honest, right? I was already an LGBTQ ally. I was already thinking very critically about scripture for many years when I encountered this. And because of my own background in the church and coming up, as a, very regular member of the church and contributor and all of that, and a leader within various parts of it. I mean, as a former evangelist, even though I had these other desires to be about human equality, the wiring in my own mind about ideas and the emotional connection I had to those ideas meant that it took me some time to actually be comfortable with the content I'm going to present today. So I'm very comfortable with it now, but I was not. Even as a okay, so and then again, and then there's some people perhaps here in person live and then watching it later who might just be like, gosh, it just frustrates me that it isn't something people can just be okay with, right? And it frustrates me maybe that Dr. Bird couldn't just be okay with it at first when she first encountered it, because that says something about my upbringing. It says something about the wiring. I say that very, I think about it that way. We have wiring that comes from the communities we grew up in. We have ways of thinking, things that we're comfortable with based on what we were exposed to, and things that we are not comfortable with because we were not exposed to it. And even if you have the best of intentions and the best of respectfulness and blah blah blah, but if you haven't worked it all through in all the different layers in the way that you think and emote and encounter people and things in this world, then you might have some sort of resistance to this. So you could be a queer person and still not be okay with what I'm about to present. That's legit, because if you grew up thinking about these things as not quite right, and you're really good at claiming that about yourself now, but you can't quite ascribe it to Jesus, or it feels weird to ascribe it to Jesus, right? Or it's saying something about this guy that the church holds up as central in a way that seems contrary to what the church has proclaimed for many centuries, right? So all of those things are happening, and I think it's important to acknowledge that and to be aware that there's probably going to be a lot of comments in the chat today, and I imagine later, 'cause, I'm going to have some people thinking I'm, calling me whatever. It's fine, but I just want to put some of that out there first. Okay. Yeah. So I think my cat's trying to join us. Okay. So I have a PowerPoint, and I have with some visuals to help set the stage a little bit, and I think I will use that just as a way to show some of what I'm. Nope, not what I meant to do. Let's try that again. Sorry. Share screen. That's what we want. Okay. Okay. So, oops, I'm not at the beginning. Sorry about that. So, I am pulling content from the the book titled "The Man Jesus Loved: Homoerotic Narratives in the New Testament," or from the New Testament. So I'm going to stay over here on my PowerPoint and just trust that everything's going smoothly in the presentation. Um, this is written by, so Theodore Jennings died a few years ago, taught at Chicago Theological Seminary, which is a UCC, essentially the most progressive seminary, Christian denomination that still can claim to be Christian. So the next step beyond UCC would be Unitarian Universalist or something, right? So he taught there for many, many years, and he was he claimed he was open about being bisexual, and he was married to a woman for many, many years. I think they even had a bit of an open relationship at times, and he had relationships with men, and I don't know about her, but I'm just saying some of this is kind of common knowledge, and it's a part of who he is. So you could say, well, of course he was looking for this, because that would confirm who he is. Or you could say his experiences, embodied experiences, helped him to see some of these things that some people have been taught not to see, or we've been taught to find ways not to be open to. So what I think is really kind of interesting are some of the questions he asks up front in his introduction. And I'm not going to cover all of this, because I do want to talk about the passages themselves, but I think it's helpful to pose some of these questions first. What if sexuality is not sinful? There's also a really interesting flip side to that question. Do you think of sexuality as sinful? If you've ever heard of or thought of sexuality as sinful, why? Where did that idea come from? If you did, where did that come from? Why is anything about sex considered not? Oh, that's interesting. Can I do that from here? Nope. Sorry. Can I add it? Nope, I can't. Okay, I can't control it from here. I have to keep going. I have to go over here. Okay. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, the question of what if sexuality is not sinful does say that people think of sexuality as sinful. And what if being sexually active is compatible with sinlessness? As in, what if sorry. Hang on a second. Hello? Okay. Sorry. What if being sexually active is compatible with sinlessness? What if your sex life doesn't make you sinful? Like, what if having a sex life is not inherently sinful? Does that shake something for any of you? Whoops. Ha, that's fun. Ah! Ah! What's going on? We'll try to do this slowly. What that leads to is what Jennings found and noted. He's not looking for it, it's what he noticed. There's a difference, right? There's a difference between wanting these passages to affirm a particular idea and noticing, because of your own life experiences, that these passages actually highlight something in a way that you maybe you've been taught to ignore or overlook. So this concept of considering erotic attachments to Jesus, I'm using his language there. What would that shift for any of you, right? Whether you're a member of the queer community or not. What might that shift? And again, I don't assume that people here are Christians. Many of you are, and many used to be, maybe have left to deconstruct or something, or left in general. And that's all, wherever you are is fine with me. But I'm thinking today of people who are in the Christian community and for whom the Bible has been, used to beat you up in some way, shape, or form. And that doesn't mean just in queer ways, right? But this applies to people whose choices around sexuality, being sexually active, have made them a target in some way. Because you're right. I don't need to dwell on that. Okay, well, we've talked about this already. I just focus on this for today. I get really sidetracked. This is why I need face-to-face, really. I need people to remind me to keep moving. Anyway, so one of the questions that Ted offered is this: what if there is evidence to confirm a form of an intimate relationship between Jesus and other people? Doesn't necessarily mean one particular type. So that's, in a sense, what we're going to look at here in a second. I want to cover, though, two terms with you. One is, I'm imagining, might be new to some of you. The other is not at all. I would not expect. But the first is this term erotophobia. I'm going to come over here to constellation. Okay, you all are having a little exchange. So erotophobia, right? It is what it sounds like, right? I love talking about terms with people, right? Pull them apart. That's what root words teach us, right? Pull these terms apart. You see phobos in there, right? Phobia, and erotic, right? Eros, love, something. And so I pulled 3 different definitions of this term, erotophobia. So the first one I pulled out was from, it's a funny kind of a pun right there. Merriam-Webster. The meaning of erotophobia is a morbid aversion. Whoa, right? Morbid aversion to sexual love or desire. Think about that for a minute. That doesn't mean just only outside of marriage. That's saying there's the realm, the dynamic of erotophobia is going to teach you to have an aversion to this on some level. I personally like the second and third definitions a little bit better. An abnormal fear of sexuality. So things around Eros, right? So is Eros sex? Is it love? Because Merriam-Webster suggests this sexual love or desire. So it's not just like intimate body parts connecting or just flesh on flesh, in some way. It goes beyond that to something about desire and attraction, maybe. I don't know. And then the Free Dictionary, an abnormal fear of sexual feelings and their physical expression. I like that one. I think that's spot on. But the point is, for you, someone listening to this or watching it as we're unfolding here, to think about this. Is this something you were taught? Maybe not directly, right? But if you think about it, and it didn't necessarily have to be in a church setting. If it's just the culture you grew up in that taught you to have a fear of sex instead of having a healthy conversation about it when it when it comes up. For you, if you happen to have a penis. No, for all people, when there's this desire, this topic, this, kind of going into these waters of this particular part of human experience for most people. Not everybody is sexually active or has sexual desires. I always want to acknowledge this kind of the spectrum of sexual experiences and expressions. But in general, right? So, um, an abnormal fear. And so if you have a fear of something, right? I mean, where does that leave you? And in particular, something that for those who have it, it is central. Like it's kind of talks about like innate things that you can't really necessarily, put a stop to, right? You can learn to curb or redirect in a very unhealthy way, right? If you've been taught to try to be straight, I wish we could change that language too, but if you've been taught to try to act like you're a hetero, even if you know deep down that that is not who you are, right? You can do that. You can mask and perform. It's not very healthy. It's certainly, I would not imagine, terribly fulfilling, right? But that's, so if this rings true for you on some level, where did that come from? Right? Was it taught to you because you didn't talk about it? Was it taught to you, in a church setting because of the way there was just a constant redirect when those came up? The way it was swept in the carpet, or you were told just wait until marriage instead of actually just talking about it? Is it in your family? You knew you just couldn't ask about those things or talk about those things? You know, I don't think it comes from just one place, but I do know that in my experience and the experience of many people I have interacted with and known over the years, this is one of the things that the church is good at, right? And promoting heteronormativity is also a part of one of the things that the church tends to be good at. Now, there are plenty of churches today that are absolutely LGBTQ friendly or are working on being that and open and welcoming, ordaining LGBTQ folks, marrying them, doing the things that say there's nothing different about you just because you do not engage in sex with the opposite gender, right? So so there are churches doing that, there are communities doing that, but historically speaking, right? So you can find moments in the church's history where what we would refer to as a gay man had in a position of power was able to have a wedding ceremony with his lover, his male lover, right? Because he had power and influence, and that happened. And who cares, right? Except, well, I kind of care because because most people don't know about that, right? Um, so this vibe, this focus on, right? The biblical texts themselves do not only talk about heteros. Now, 99% of them do, right? You only hear about marriage between a man and a woman. You only hear about, right, these things, certain things between a man and a woman. But there are biblical texts that challenge heteronormativity. There are also biblical texts that challenge gender binary. So there are all kinds of things about this that they aren't many, but there are some there that are really interesting. Okay. So heteronormativity, the belief that heterosexuality is the only normal sexual expression, or in Oxford's definition, right, a dislike of or prejudice against gay people, which many people growing up in a church will be taught, but unconsciously. You are taught it unconsciously because people of same sex, same gender couples are not talked about. So by absence, right, by omission, you are taught heteronormative thoughts. Okay. I know I was, right? Okay. So an aversion to, okay. I think that, let's see. So I'm going to go ahead and look at, all right. So let's just go over here at looking at the time now. I think I want to go over to biblical texts themselves, since that's the That's the idea of story time, is looking at texts themselves. So what I want to do then is talk about the beloved disciple and what happens when we look at the beloved disciple through the eyes of first century Greek male audience, right? That's the predominant audience of the Gospel of John, or audience for the Gospel of John, right? Greek male, somewhat educated, and so even if you're, you know, even if you already don't think and don't need the Gospels to be historically accurate, I'd like to encourage you to, in particular, when it comes to John's Gospel, let's just not care about how historically accurate this is. I think that applies to all four, but it so anyway, wherever you're coming from, I'm just trying to make it easy for people coming from a wide range of perspectives and experiences on this one to be able to hear this. So I guess that's all I'm trying to do. Um, so let's just see what's happening, right? What do you know about the lover-beloved relationships in Greek culture, Greek society, ancient Greek culture and society? So I imagine many of you are actually decently familiar or have some vague familiarity. You've heard some ideas, yada, yada, right? So what we're talking about are relationships that, as far as I know, were between men, and I don't know of any, right, that would fall under this rubric or fall under this label that were between two women. All kinds of reasons for that. And it's men who were older, in a position of power or in a position of some form of being established in culture and politics, say, um, and in the community, taking a younger one under their wing. And there are various ways that this played out, and some of them involved sexual intimacy or sexual encounters and expressions and experiences. And these could be men, the older men would likely have families, because you can't be in politics without having a family. Have you noticed that? Even today, still to this day, it's hard to be in politics in the United States if you're not Christian and if you're single. Or the higher up you try to go, the more important it is that you be. Anyway, tangent, but not entirely. Okay. So we're talking about men who would have had wives and families. So hetero looking, right? And then they also have this little side piece, this little sweet thing on the side who is, maybe prepubescent or just starting to be pubescent, and or early as a young man, and all kinds of things. And so is this an abuse of power? Yes, I would say it was at times. I don't I don't want to get into all that, although I think it's important to get into that on a certain level. Okay. So is this is this modeling a relationship that was fraught with problems? Potentially, yes. Okay. Just going to say it and move on, if that's okay, because I want to get to the point, which is there's an established dynamic or aspect of the culture that the gospel writer of John is using intentionally, and is saying it's a way of giving Jesus more credibility. It's a way of giving him more palatability to Greek men in the first century, to depict him as having a beloved. Now, what I grew up thinking of, or the first time I'm conscious of this story, I was taught to think of the beloved disciple is essentially a stand-in for everyone who follows Jesus, right? Jesus loves everyone. This I know, for the Bible tells me so. I'm not trying to be snarky here, but that was the way that I was taught to handle the references to the beloved disciple, or the man Jesus loved. The one Jesus loved is what the Greek is actually saying most of the time. The one Jesus loved. So Jesus loves everybody. So the beloved disciple, or the disciple whom Jesus loves, stands in for everybody. And that's how you kind of are like, oh, this is how I relate to Jesus, is the way that Jesus loves him. And so I just think that that's a clever way of getting around it. And it's also a disingenuous way, because you're actually, I think, doing a disservice to the scriptures when you do that. Okay. So there's all that. what else do we need to say before we look at this together? This is why I had in this slideshow, but I'm not going over it specifically with you, is, where does, for instance, it says that this is the one whom Jesus loved, but if Jesus loved everybody, then that's not special. But when the context of John's gospel, that actually is really special. Um, John's gospel refers to Jesus loving all of his disciples. Okay, that's great, right? It refers to him loving Martha and Mary and Lazarus, those three siblings. It also says that it refers to Jesus loving Lazarus separately, like on his own, So that has raised questions for some people. Is Lazarus actually the beloved disciple or the one whom Jesus loves in John's gospel? Legitimate question. I don't feel like getting into that because that's not my intention right now. But that's it. Like there isn't a love connection between Jesus and anyone really, except for this particular character. And what's important about a beloved, the lover and beloved, those two labels are used in this relationship. Jesus is the lover, and the beloved is the one he loves and he's taken care of, or whatever that is. But the thing is, that person isn't the beloved because of their great mind or their great whatever. They're just the one that the lover wants to love on for who knows what reasons, maybe besides he's just attracted to them, right? Or desires to be close to them, whatever. So what you notice, if you can do this, is you see that the one whom Jesus loved doesn't have special knowledge. The only thing special that this disciple has is physical closeness to Jesus. That's it. And that took me time to wrap my head around and be comfortable with. And just let that be that, because all that's saying is that Jesus also had this kind of a relationship. Whether or not he actually did historically doesn't matter. What matters is the gospel writer is depicting Jesus that way, and it's in the canon. Not a problematic relationship necessarily by default for the gospel writer. Interesting in and of itself, but there you have it, right? So we're going to see something positive here, and maybe even too directional. But we don't even get that. But we do kind of get that. Okay, so let's look at some of the passages then that relate. And I don't think I showed the slide. So if you're curious, I might not. So I'll refer to them. But in particular, the references here comes Minerva, my cat, are chapter 13, verse 23, chapter 19, verse 26, chapter 20, verse 2, chapter 21, verse 7 and 20. So that's where I'm going to go and do some reading here. Finally get to story time, half an hour into this, but I needed to do the setup, right? That was important. So the other thing to note then, as we get into this, is that he's the one Jesus loved, and he is being pointed out as that disciple in the midst of the first time this disciple is noted in that way. Hang on a second. She's going to be upset and unhappy. So unless I just pick her up and give her some love. So we're just going to do that. Yeah, cats always get their way. Yes, right? So the Last Supper, as it's called by many people, the Last Supper in John is this. It's different from the final meal that he eats with his disciples in the Synoptic Gospels. So in John, Jesus is actually going to be the Passover lamb. So the dinner that he eats with them is the night before Passover in John's Gospel, whatever. And that's where we get this long, like 3 or 4 chapters of content about how much Jesus loves his disciples, the world, blah, blah, blah. And so in the context of saying, I've loved you so much that I'm going to lay down my life, love one another this way by laying down your life for each other. This is about love, 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 love. And in the midst of that, this disciple is pointed out or singled out as the one Jesus loves. Right? So it's actually quite powerful that the first time we hear about this character, this person, is in the midst of their final meal together at that table, right? So we get in chapter 13, before the festival of the Passover. Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. All kinds of things about John's gospel that are, anyway, I need to stick to the topic. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. All of them, right? Knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going to God. Again, this is a Greek paradigm that's being used, very appealing to a Greek ear. Got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin, began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with a towel that was tied around him. I do not think he's giving them hand jobs, by the way. I do not think this is sexual. But people usually ask, is this a euphemism? Is this the euphemistic use of feet, or is this actual feet? I think it's actual feet, but that's just me. It gets to Simon Peter, and he's like, no, you don't get to wash my feet. I should wash yours. Simon's just constantly not really fully understanding. And then they have this whole thing, right? After he washed their feet, he put on his robe and had returned to the table. He said to them, do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that's what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's. And this is why some Christians like to do feet washing ceremonies or whatever, which is, I never really stopped to think about it before and didn't really bother me until some people started pointing out that it makes them very uncomfortable. So forth and so on. And then we get to, after saying all this, very truly I tell you, whoever receives one whom I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. So very, very Johannine language here about Jesus coming from the heavenly realm to the earth with an intent, a purpose, and then returning to the heavenly realm. This descending, ascending paradigm that is a very Greek paradigm. And here comes the good stuff, right? After saying this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, very truly, actually, it's seriously, I tell you, one of you will betray me. I say that meaning, instead of saying very truly, I think what's trying to be communicated in the Greek there is seriously, come on, pay attention, okay? So it doesn't say seriously in the Greek. The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. One of the disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. This is where it gets really fun. Some of you may have seen, I talked about this on Myth Vision at one point, and so some of you may have seen this, but the English translations on this will vary, and they are almost all of them are trying to put distance between this disciple and Jesus physically here in the way that they reflect in the translation, in the way they render their translation to make it sound like he's lying next to him, right? As my English was reclining next to him. Well, actually, the language in the Greek here implies was reclining in his lap. I mean, it's not, we're sitting at a table respectfully with our napkins in our laps and all the prim and proper stuff. No, I mean, this was a dinner where you did recline at the table, and Jesus and this one were spooning, okay? But I certainly never got that impression from anything I read growing up, or in Bible study in Young Life, and in any of those times I did that kind of stuff. So one of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining in his lap, Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So, hey, come here. So while reclining, my English says reclining next to Jesus. I'm going to say while reclining and while spooning with Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it? Who are you talking about? So he leans forward to hear Peter's question. He leans back into his lap and he's like, hey, who are you talking about? Right? Jesus answered, it is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I've dipped it in the dish. So silly and sly. So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After he received the piece of bread, yada, yada. So there's that. So that's the first reference we get to the one Jesus loved. In the context of this thing he has just done to show how much he loves all of them, this one is the one who's special, right? And this one doesn't have special knowledge. It's not like Jesus has talked about this before. And so the one closest to him physically or sexually intimate with him already knows this. No, he doesn't, but he has access to him. Okay. All right. So there's that. And then the next reference is in chapter 19. From what I've seen, looking up the Greek here, the literal word is bosom, reclining in his bosom. Although I'm just going to put this up here. I appreciate that, Caitlin. Although what bosom means with respect to a man, maybe it means lap. And bosom, it does mean up here, right? So they're reclining at a table, and it's why I say spooning. I mean, it's this laying in each other's embrace, right? If you imagine that if you imagine a table, low, very low to the ground, triclinium, right? And in such a way, everybody's eating at this table that we all have to lie down, right? So how is your body going to be positioned if there's a table very close to the ground to which you want access so that you can eat? Think about how your body will be positioned. And so laying on the ground, parallel to the ground, and then the next person over has some space, right? But between you and him, or in this case, there were probably also some females around the table. But so in his bosom would mean, like if you cuddle with, your partner in bed at night, does one of you, the one in the back, put their arm around you, the other, and there's kind of, you're in that person's bosom, right? You're laying in, that's what I'm trying to say. Something like that, right? Looks kind of like that. Okay, I know. Okay. I hope that helped. Oh, huh. I don't know what that apple. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, you wouldn't be casualing with just a casual friend. I mean, I don't know if I ever have. I'm not trying to shame people who might do that, with friends, but at dinner and that kind of intimacy, and this person whom is the one that Jesus loved, right? And everybody knew it. That's the part that I also like about this. It's not like we don't have any reason to think nobody knew, like Peter knew to ask the one hanging out in his lap, the one that Jesus liked to cuddle with or whatever, right? It's not like someone saying, we didn't catch this. We didn't know what was going on. So the other pieces of this book that are helpful in understanding this are what we see in terms of, interestingly enough, what is said while Jesus is hanging on the cross, while he's slowly losing his breath because he's slowly being suffocated, because that's how you die when you're crucified. You are nailed to some form of a cross, a tree, things that are nailed together in that shape, and you're either tied, your hands are tied to the crossbeam, or they're nailed, whichever it is. The point being to suspend your lungs. They are slowly crushed and slowly unable to give you enough breath. And it can take hours to die of crucifixion because of that. So what's happening as he's dying, and the exchange, the thing that is attributed to Jesus in that moment, is really quite startling if you read it through the eyes or the lens of what Ted Jennings shows us. So here, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but we get, Pilate had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, which is all kinds of interesting for a different conversation. Many of the Jews read this inscription because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. And it was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. The initials for it most likely were. And then the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man said, I am the King of the Jews. Another conversation for another day. What I've written, Just get on with it. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, meaning he wasn't dead yet. They had just completed nailing him or suspending him. They took his clothes, divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic, blah, blah, blah. Let us not tear it, blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister. I haven't looked up the Greek here recently. It gets a little bit complicated. The Greek is a little bit complicated here, which again is just interesting to me. So we have his mother, whose name is Mary, his mother's sister. And so I don't know if his mother's sister is separate or is the same woman as his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas. It's hard to tell, even in the Greek, but we'll just call that. So we could call that 3 if you want. His mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Those 3 women, or 4, depending which way you want to count it. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her. Now, this is why some people say that Mary Magdalene is the disciple Jesus loved, right? Because we just mentioned 3 or 4 women, but not the one Jesus loved separately. So some people say that's why she is the one he loved. I don't necessarily need it to be that. I can see why people want that to be the case, and I think that's an honest reading of it, right? What's being suggested here is that we think of those were the women standing near the cross, and then Jesus looked and saw the one he loved also standing near his mother. That's what this reading is suggesting. You don't have to agree with it. When he saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Not, "Behold me, your son," but, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." So, and from that hour, the disciple took her. And I do remember the Greek here. The English I'm reading says took her into his own home, but it's actually into his own things, took her into his own. So from the perspective of a man is dying and is looking at his partner and his mother and is saying, "You two belong to each other now." I think that's pretty powerful. I think that's really quite beautiful. And regardless of whether you agree with that reading, I hope you can see how that is possible. It is a possible reading that, if it had been a female and that he was actually married to, I don't think any of us would have a hard time reading it that way, right? "Hey, Mary, check out mom. Mom, here's my wife. Here's my woman, Mary. You belong to each other now, right? Take care of each other. I'm dying. I'm moving on. So it's up. You two are left together, right?" Do you see my point? It would be, for many people, much easier to read that scene if it were Mary Magdalene, for instance, who was the one, the one Jesus loved, the disciple he loved. But I think that the rendering that Jennings suggests makes a lot of sense. Again, no special knowledge, no special anything, except just special for just being him. Which is also another thing that's lovely about this, right? It's not like he had to be excellent at something to be well loved by Jesus. He just was. Anyway, so there's that. And then we move on to chapter 20. And there's another lovely way of looking at that. I'm looking at the time here. So let me just briefly refer to this. Let's see, what's 21, 1 and 7? Yeah, well, there's a reference to in chapter 21, the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And so they have this whole thing about, the one whom Jesus loved is or is not getting special treatment in chapter 21. But, and Jesus' comment is, "What is it to you, to Peter, if I love this one differently or if I think this one's special?" But what I really think is interesting is in chapter 20, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them. So first of all, there's that the gospel writer is saying that Mary Magdalene is different from the one whom Jesus loved. Again, I don't need any of it to be historically accurate or whatever, but it's interesting to note that this particular suggestion and interpretation holds, right? She said to them, "They've taken the Lord out of the tomb. We do not know where they've laid him." And Peter said to the other disciple, then Peter and the other disciple set out and went toward the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Just imagine being that one who was special to Jesus, right? Not giving up and pushing through. The two were running together, but the one outran Peter. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. The other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture. Blah, 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 blah. And it goes on, and he points out kind of an interesting take on how this one who was special to Jesus would want or need special condoling, or would need to grieve in a way that was different, perhaps, from others. So maybe not as juicy as the title for today made it sound. Was the beloved disciple just a friend to Jesus? I would suggest that within the context of the first century, for a Greek audience, predominantly male, that Jesus is being depicted as a lover to a beloved. I don't think there's any question about that, actually. And that would have implied the special sexual intimacy, physical intimacy, both. And I don't think that there needs to be any reason for anyone to be uncomfortable by that. But people are, and people have been so uncomfortable with it that we've been taught not to even see it for what it is. We've been taught to reinterpret it as something more spiritual, which is what people have been taught to do with most of the message of Jesus, is to turn it from the political and economic critique that it is to something spiritual, which is more palatable to more people. So I think that the gospel writer of John was absolutely intentionally trying to depict Jesus in this particular kind of a relationship to give him more credence, to give him more of an appeal or more of a draw to more Greek men in the first century, at the end of the first century. And that there was no shame here. There was no shame in that depiction. There's no shame intended for either of the men involved in that relationship. And it would have been physical and sexual, and different from any of the relationships that he had with other male disciples. I mean, there you have it, right? There are no men at the cross at watching Jesus die, except for the one whom Jesus loved. Go look at the cross scenes, right? It's the only one. There's another commentary there about women being brave. Also being overlooked as humans in general, so it's safer on a certain level for them to go reap at the execution of their leader. But yeah, so was the beloved disciple more than just friends? I think that the beloved disciple in John's gospel is absolutely intended to be that. And that the church is not comfortable with that depiction of Jesus with another man is a big piece of this issue of erotophobia and homophobia, or heteronormativity, and why so many people who grow up in a church don't have healthy conversations about sex and sexuality, and therefore have had a chance to be honest about the fact that we actually have a range of sexual expressions and sexual desires and interests, and that's just normal and natural and okay, instead of anything that falls outside of hetero is bad and sinful and wrong. I mean, it just is fascinating to me how much being able to see this could have helped so many people over the centuries, you know? I do think women can be quite brave, yes. Let's see. All this confusion around language, we can think about when transgender folks talk about their older friends and called, and they're okay. I don't know what you're talking about. I think it's just as sentimental as a male lover. It doesn't change the meaning. Yeah. In the records of antiquities, it explains that during this time period, the Romans crucified people on a single log. Interesting, nailed above. Oh, well, I think that would actually, it might make it go a little faster. I'm not sure. Okay, so thanks for being here, or thanks for watching if you're watching it later. And I hope that gave you something to think about that you hadn't either put together in the same way or hadn't heard of previously. I hope there's something new in this for you. I will be back on Thursday to either finish up from the Gospels if I've forgotten a story, or move on back to the Hebrew Bible passages. I appreciate those of you joining me live who are able to do that and want to do that. And thanks. Yeah, it's been fun. I hope I addressed most of, well, I didn't pay attention today. So anyway, thank you for being here. I'll see you Thursday.